Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. November is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and where we highlight the importance of creating meaningful support systems for the men in our lives. In the Western world, the suicide rates for men is more than 3 times higher than that of women. The reason for this often comes down to a mix of factors: societal pressures that tell men to tough it out, stigma that makes seeking help feel unapproachable, unhealthy coping habits, lack of community, and the weight of life's stresses. Today we'll be joined by Clearhead's very own clinical psychologist Sam O'Sullivan to unpack why there is such a gender difference in mental health outcomes and what we can do about it. Sam is a clinical psychologist and creator of Tough Talk, a documentary series focused on men's well-being in New Zealand. Before Tough Talk, he developed a men's well-being project at the Mental Health Foundation before traveling around New Zealand for 2 years interviewing men about their mental health as part of Tough Talk. He currently works as a product manager at Clearhead and is the Wellbeing Coordinator at the Learning Environment, an environmental charity focused on training young people to improve community, resilience, and well-being. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Angela, for having me here. And kia ora koutou. Hey to everyone out there. Thanks for being here today, and just want to acknowledge you, the places where you're from. I can see someone is down in Wellington, Te Whanganui Atara. Just acknowledging those places, the tangata whenua of those places, your ancestors, and all the people who have brought you here to this webinar today. Ngā mihi. And just really briefly, just a trigger warning before we get going. This topic, a lot of what we'll talk about is really positive and easy to talk about, but there are aspects to this topic that may reference suicide or physical or sexual violence. So just be prepared for those topics.
To kick us off, Sam, maybe you could share a little bit with us around what got you started on the journey that you're on now.
Sure. I think for me, there's been 2 kind of weaving strands to my own journey. One is very much professional as a psychologist, and the other is more personal as basically a man in New Zealand of a particular identity. I'll start with the professional one because I think that's the one I've been the most conscious about during the journey. I was really thinking about it, whereas my more personal journey, I think, had been unconscious a lot of the time and became more conscious in reflection. That was a big part of what brought me into this kind of topic. So professionally, I'm a psychologist. I trained down in Otago University, and my first job was just out of Wellington in Porirua at an inpatient hospital called Kiripuru. So it was a regional rehabilitation facility. That basically means people who come from the community into their own locations, their own local places, are struggling a lot and probably can't get the help from local hospitals, local community mental health support. So they end up in this facility where they live, and we try our best to rehabilitate them. So I went there after the training as my first job, which was just a big step into the deep end, and perhaps naively at first. And what I noticed immediately working there, compared to some of my earlier community placements when I was training, was that probably, and I don't know the exact statistics, about 80% of people there were men. So when you get down into the deep end, you're seeing a lot of men. And then the 20% of the women who were there, and I can speak more to what I even mean by men and women later on, were victims generally of male sexual violence. So it was really obvious where the problems were. Whereas earlier on in the journey of mental health, like in the community, I saw a lot more people presenting that were women. I'm not saying any of what was causing their problems were actually particularly different. They're all very distressing issues, but they were seeking support earlier, expressing what was going on with them, for them. And that was quite different to some of these guys that I was talking to had been right through the system, wraparound support, various clinicians, heaps of people, whānau, everyone engaged, but had maybe never talked about some of the incidents that led them into that path. And sometimes for the first time were talking to me, if we could even get them to, and all we really had on record was kind of like, the crimes or significant events that had occurred. So you're sort of thinking, well, I'm thinking, God, I really wish these guys had opened up earlier. There could be a big difference. And perhaps even these guys who were violent towards some of the women there, perhaps if they had sought support earlier, that wouldn't have happened. So I worked there and I learned a lot about the male psyche in New Zealand. I noticed a lot of those guys were Māori and Pacifica, and there were Pākehā, there were kind of more privileged white men there, but what I noticed about them is they were a minority, but there was a pattern where one of them, they usually had one controlling parent. Whether it was mother or the father, it was both, and really high expectations on them. So that was an interesting pattern I observed in the more world of privilege and white people. Not that all the white people there were privileged, but that pattern did exist. I just started to see a lot there, because it was really like, for lack of a better word, black and white when it's that extreme, when you're seeing like the dark side of New Zealand culture play out, but then you can start to see it in other people in more grey areas, but it's clearer. I can see those same patterns in everyday people. So I learned a profound amount there, but it was also really intense and really traumatizing, and I burnt out and I left and I felt like I failed. And that was when I started to actually get into the men's wellbeing space, and work with the Mental Health Foundation, and did a bunch of research in that space. God, that was a great opportunity to like talk to people with lived experience, talk to experts, do a bunch of reading, and really level up. And unfortunately, that project didn't happen. And I was getting frustrated at the time through trying to make things happen in these institutions. So I went off and did Tough Talk as my own project, where I just like picked up a camera, learned the creative skills, learned how to market myself, and just got on with it and just got content out there. And the strategy being, hey, just talk to guys around New Zealand about their experiences of diverse identities, so people could relate to them. And that was really successful. And I can talk more about that later. And personally, it's quite different, though. I think I was less aware of my identity growing up, less aware of the kind of various social forces that were happening around me. What I can say is I need to position myself as a particular identity. What I mean is I'm Pākehā, I'm a white man. That means, and when I say that, I mean the world is going to respond to different identities differently. That, for instance, you could have a tall person, and they might become a good basketball player. And you've got to ask, is that because they have a biological advantage? Or does the world respond to them and go, you're tall, you should join the basketball team. Oh, I'll coach you more. I'll support you. I think you've got real potential. And it gets complicated, right? Because you might get a Māori basketball player, and they might actually get equally encouraged as a Pākehā basketball player in this context, because basketball is well known for the American players. There's a lot of African American players. I work with young Māori, and basketball is a real like source of pride and identity for rangatahi. And so I think it's interesting in that context where you put them in front of a police officer, put them in front of maybe a teacher, and they might respond to them different just because of their body, right? Just the way they look, the situation they were born into. None of us can control this. So I think the world really changes just purely based on there's like a whole hierarchy and complex interaction of our identity playing out and just the way the world reacts. And I think I experience privilege in my identity. I'm able-bodied, I'm cisgendered. That means, I was born basically male anatomy, and I see myself as a male. I'm also open to be calling they, them. I don't love being put into a box as a man, because I think people treat you a certain way, and I think I can be really feminine, whatever that means, when I want to be. But I think because of my identity, there are aspects of it that, maybe I went to all boys school, and maybe I wasn't as traditionally masculine as some of my peers. I was also maybe a little neurodivergent. I think I haven't had that diagnosis, but I didn't easily fit into the social norms. I questioned them. I didn't understand them. I just didn't naturally go, oh, that makes sense. Everyone does that. That's how I should be. So I got really bullied at school. So despite my privilege, I did experience discrimination in my own way. And that was really hard. That meant like verbal insults in class, out class. That meant being completely excluded at times and having no friends and no one really. That meant, being ganged up on physically, emotionally, and it was just really, I think, really distressing. And I think one unique aspect of that, of being a man, and I've heard this from people who've done gender transitions from women into men, and the other way around, and I've heard this from other guys, is I felt quite lonely in that. I never would tell on the bullies. There was a code there was a social code. I didn't tell my parents. They're shocked to hear this. I didn't speak to my peers or anyone. I had friends out of school about what was happening and how I was feeling at all. And it was a really lonely experience. And by the time I got to university, I was having panic attacks, major social anxiety issues. I wasn't the person you're hearing speak today. And I think because of my privilege and because of like the education I received and the support I received to go to university, I was able to learn and go, that's anxiety. Holy shit, that's what's happening. I was able to understand that I could breathe and reduce that anxiety. I could develop skills like mindfulness. And I started to learn about psychology and unpack my thoughts and kind of untie all these thought patterns I was having and take actually really constructive steps towards talking in front of people and teaching psychology, and did all these things. I really started to understand, I was shaking in front of people, so I would expose myself to shaking in front of people and just get through it and breathe and really consciously, because I had this privilege, develop and become a really confident person in these sorts of situations where I can talk in front of like huge groups of people and feel largely relaxed, if not a little bit anxious. And I think personally, I really wanted to share those tools with other people. Like, I'm not here to be a white savior, but I really do, and particularly in other roles I have, and in Clearhead, I really want to increase the accessibility of these tools, and to work with people who might not have had those advantages, so then they can make the impact in their own communities in the future. I don't want to be relied on. I just want to empower people. So I think those two parts of my story, really wove together to bring me into this space. And funny enough, then doing Tough Talk and learning about tech and stuff, I think brought me into working with Clearhead, was I developed this kind of product management skills. So yeah, I can talk more about Tough Talk, but I think that's enough to answer that question there, Angela.
Yeah, so thank you for being so vulnerable with your story. And as you mentioned, sometimes someone looking on the outside, getting to know you for the first time, wouldn't even know that story and how that shaped you. And I'm sure what you have shared today will kind of really set the basis in which how deep we're going into the conversation, and it's almost like no holds bar in terms of what we will share. Maybe as a starting point, obviously you shared your story in terms of what's started your mental health journey personally, the triggers that was occurring in your life. But what did you learn when you were in that inpatient unit? And as well as through the documentary, interviewing all these different men, what were the common reasons that had drove these men to where they were in terms of having the poor mental health state that they were in?
Great question, and there's a huge answer to that. So I'll just give you some of the lessons. I think the end result, whether people experience anxiety, depression, psychosis, bipolar, the various issues are quite similar. So I think men experience the same issues and the same psychology and same distress. But what I think can be different is what causes it and what affects its development, and also the way people cope with it. I do think biology plays a role, and I think it's important to distinguish that. I think you can be born with basically, I'm just going to name the anatomy. You can be born with a penis or a vagina. But then it's more complex than that. These people with intersex, these complex places about people's internal biology that isn't black or white. You also have testosterone and estrogen, and that differs. It's not like all men have high testosterone. It's not, and some women may have high testosterone. I think it's really useful to look at people and kind of make an assessment of, I wonder how like masculine or feminine, even though this is now talking about gender, so it's another layer apart from biology. But it's in wonder, and I think first question, regardless of their biology, regardless of that penis or vagina, what is their biology, and maybe they have an opinion on that too. So I really learned to look at people more broadly than just being male or female. And then, of course, on you have gender, which is more the social aspect, the norms, the behaviors, the expressions that we expect of people with different biologies. And then, of course, you have sexuality, which is who you're attracted to. And I just wanted to define that because I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about is relatable to a lot of people in New Zealand. One thing that just jumps out at me, actually from Tough Talk, is talking to guys. What I would find in Tough Talk was guys really do want to talk. And when I show up and I'm open and I'm vulnerable and I'm sort of doing a certain kaupapa that is about mental health, that one-on-one, guys would love to open up. Like everyone's like, how do you find these guys? I'm like, they're everywhere. They're like people you wouldn't suspect, given the right opportunity, the right setting, the right person, they're going to open up and they're going to jump on that opportunity. But then I'm going, well, why don't you do that? And they're like, well, it's hard around other guys. And it's also hard, especially guys in rural communities, going, well, there's a lot of really tough women, maybe high testosterone women. And I want to be attractive. And actually it can be seen as unattractive to be vulnerable, to not be traditionally strong. And at the end of the day, I don't want to be unattractive. I want to get a mate. I want to have a partner. I want to be seen as an attractive person in my community. And that made me go, oh, wow, okay, cool. This isn't just a male thing. This is something that's related to our culture that is actually affecting us on quite a deep level, on a level of like desire and like attraction. And actually women need to maybe change what on a deep level, what is attractive and what we see as attractive. And of course the media and various forces that play too. But one thing I will point out is it is a New Zealand and it is an Australian issue, because when you go look at China, the suicide rates for men and women are 1-to-1. And here they're over 2-to-1, so over double as many men killing themselves each year as women. And so clearly it's not just biology, you know, clearly like testosterone may play a role, but culture and what we've kind of constructed as what men can and can't do is deeply affecting people. And it goes further than just gender. I think when you look at some of these stats, you realize actually the highest proportion of suicide occurs for young male Māori men. And actually within men too, often it's people with LGBTQ rainbow community identities that are experiencing distress. And quickly you're going, well, why is that? And it's discrimination. You know, it's if we don't allow, ultimately, if people don't feel comfortable to be and express who they are as a person, that's going to be distressing. And the same for someone, like if we just suddenly made a rule that, for example, like maybe you have a white woman mother and you say, well, or a white woman that really is a really nurturing, really caring person, that they are traditionally feminine. And you say, well, you can't be a mother. You're not allowed in this country. We don't believe that's right. That's going to be really distressing. And we saw that in like the 50s too, like with, women as a whole sex, like biological sex being forced into being housewives. And that, led to a number of problems at that time. So I do think one thing I've learnt in New Zealand and in the Australian context is really similar is I do think colonisation has played a huge role in what's happened. Both the Pākehā men coming here as pioneers and being hard and tough because they were essentially clearing land and trying to set up new communities, and they didn't understand the landscape, didn't understand the food systems here, whereas Māori really did. And on the other side, Māori experiencing a huge amount of violence and disease and, just complete decimation of their culture from their settlers, particularly when the British government came in. And I think there's similarities in Australia to that mentality, both in the pioneers and the settlers and in the local people. And I think that's caused a lot of trauma. And I think that's why you see mainly Māori and Pacifica people in a regional hospital for the Lower North Island. And I do think around the Pākehā people too, like you're seeing a culture of forced like to be a certain type of person, to maybe it's okay to be angry, maybe it's okay to be violent. Actually, that's safer to be that way than to be vulnerable and sad and anxious for a lot of men, so that can lead to these acts of violence. And interesting, I think in this country, one largely positive thing I think that happened was actually rugby, as I think this sport actually brought awareness to racism. It was a sport where it was a competition, and we developed a shared identity on this common ground of like success as a nation through something we're good at, whether you're Māori, Pākehā, or any culture in New Zealand. We're a largely multicultural country. And that led to a sense of pride, and it led to like things like the Springbok Tour protests. And but I also think with that is physical, and there's a drinking culture around it these days. So I think that can lead to certain socially accepted ways of coping with distress. Compared to, say, talking, to feeling, to being emotionally expressive. It's complex. Biologically, testosterone helps you compartmentalize emotions. When you have higher estrogen, you've got to deal with that emotion up front. That is an expression. You talk to people who are trans and and they've experienced high testosterone levels and high estrogen levels, and they'll talk about differences with emotional experience. So there are biological things, there's huge social things, and there's an entire history within the context of our places that's leading to these problems, and then our ability to even feel comfortable coping with them in ways that we know work. We know talking about mental health works. We know expressing our emotions works, seeking support early on the journey, being open. That's what helped me. And there were huge barriers to me doing that, especially when I was young. And then you get older and you realize, like, I don't really care what people think of me. I'm just comfortable with my identity. And I think it can get political. Different people believe you should be able to only express your identity a certain way. We're seeing big issues around sort of political issues around being trans at the moment. It's complex, and we're still, the world's evolving. Power. We've been a world run by men. It's been patriarchal, and that hasn't necessarily been good for men. Look at any health stat, and you see both in physical health, men aren't doing well either. Violence, men are the biggest victims of violence. Sexual violence is different. Men are the biggest perpetrators of violence. Men aren't doing so well because of the way they've run the world. But that's changing. And now people are upset by that. Transition's always hard. At the moment, some men at least are finding it hard to transition into not necessarily being the provider. And I think transition's always difficult. It can be distressing. So hopefully that, I could go on and on and on, but hopefully that answers your question. As I think it's complicated, and I think New Zealand, Australia, we have commonalities, and I think we need to look at it like we're quite different to a country like China, socially, culturally, and this is affecting men. But it's not that men have different experiences. Biology plays a role, but largely it's actually the social constraints that give us the different statistics. Because even now, even in my own friend groups, people I know who are getting more comfortable about talking about therapy, who are getting more comfortable about being open and vulnerable and with each other, there's still times where people, it's just hard. It's really hard to take a step and be honest about how we're feeling and even become aware of how we're feeling in the first place, to even know there's an actual issue that isn't just I'm pissed off or I'm just, I don't know, tired at the moment. Hopefully that's a bit of an answer to your question, Angela. I mean, keep rolling from there.
I guess, as you said, when you then went on to that documentary journey, you found all these men who were very willing to talk to you one-on-one. What was different about that environment that allowed them to open up to you in a way that they have not been able to, as you had described previously?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot to that. I think I actually think one-on-one is really important for me and for people, but I do find in a group situation, me and people behave quite differently depending on who's around. I'll give you one example. I was actually at a party during Tough Talk, but it's very much always, it didn't matter where I was or what I was doing. I was just representing that kaupapa. I was like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. And one guy talked to me who was quite traditionally masculine in appearance and in his attitude. And he heard what I was doing, and he actually started to share with me about a quite significant problem with a friend who was a woman and breaching her consent and her boundaries and them working through it as friends. I thought it was a beautiful story, actually, and a really probably quite common story of where sexual assault can occur and why it occurs. And really cool that there was a sense of like restorative justice, or they were actually working through it and both getting some closure. Because that can be great. It's a whole nother conversation. But then his mate walked up and to take a pee, and he literally broke the conversation. I was like, hey mate, how's your penis? And I was like, whoa, what? Like, it was just such a radical shift from like open sharing to like hyper masculinity, performative masculinity. I'm just performing as a man right now what I think I should be doing because my mate's looking at me and I'm maybe feeling anxious about having this conversation. And then as soon as his mate left, he just continued as if nothing had happened. And I was like, wow, I found that jarring. But I kind of understand it. So I think privacy, don't call people out in public. That's not a way to support someone. Create the right situation to talk. And I think fundamentally, one of the biggest tips I could give for having these conversations is do something. Don't just sit and talk. That is confronting. I think there's lots of reasons why people, and men in particular, people with high testosterone can find that challenging. I think people don't always agree with evolutionary explanations, but I think one I've enjoyed is for a long time, men traditionally hunted together. That was common. It wasn't always just men, but a lot of times it was. And that would be done in relative silence, with a lot of non-verbal communication occurring. So it's quite a comfortable space. And I think men have developed this need for silence in processing a conversation, whereas I think it was quite different for women largely. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But that's one way I think about it, because I've noticed having easy silence, going for a walk, even a drive, looking at a fire, these kind of things allow for space. It's less, you're side by side, you're not face to face. We really support less anxiety, less uncomfortable conversations. So that's I think a really, really important tip actually. And yeah, it sounds basic, but it's just fundamental, is pick your time, pick your place. And then share yourself. I think why people can find me a safe person to share is I'll generally be pretty open about my own experiences, and just raw and honest with people about myself. And I think that allows people this, like, right, this guy's not going to judge me for doing that, because he's just openly doing it. He doesn't even know me. And that really works. I think you got to be vulnerable to get vulnerability in return. Not necessarily every time, but it can really help. I think it's important to I listen. Like, watch Tough Talk. You'll just see me listening. Like, I'm putting these guys on a platform and I'm listening. I'm asking good questions occasionally when it becomes time to ask a question. But I'm largely listening and not trying to problem solve. I think that's just so fundamental, even for guys who people kind of see as quite solutions focused. What people need is to let it out, to feel with them. The only solution you need to provide is being there. That is literally the solution, is being there, being open, feeling, being calm. That takes practice. I think some people find that harder than others. I think being a calm listener, no matter what they bring up. If they bring up suicide, be calm. It's actually a lot of the time suicide or thinking about suicide is really normal. And I think being able to express that for the first time to someone and not have them freaked out is really important and really healing. And a lot of guys will be thinking about it. That doesn't mean they're going to act on it. And that's fine. If they have a plan and you're worried they're going to act on it soon, definitely get professional support. Call on the police if you need to, if it's really imminent. But don't necessarily jump there. I think a next step can be like contacting a therapist, supporting them to get professional help. And then you can escalate from there as needed. But most of the time, just talking about that they've had these thoughts might actually save their life. So be calm and listen, and just like if there's any sense of risk, I know you can't assess risk, you're not all clinicians, but if there's anything that's making you think they actually have a plan and they might actually do something about it, then it's definitely time to contact some support. And like ask questions. I think a simple question to ask is trying to understand the pain they're experiencing and go, where's the pain coming from? Like where is that? Like why are you distressed? What's causing this? Quite commonly it's relationship problems. Quite commonly it's a sense of purpose. Quite commonly it's being alone and lonely. Like these are just really common experiences. You don't need to get deep into understanding the family dynamics, all these things a therapist might do. You can just be there and be like, oh yeah, that's tough. I've like lost, I've been dumped. That sucks. And tell me more. How are you feeling? How are you doing? And you just tell them you'll be there for them too. I think that can make a big difference. Just say you'll be there. Tell them that if they're ever thinking about suicide a lot, give you a call. Set up a support system. There's probably some more tips I could get into, but that'll do for now.
And so you gave a really good sort of framework around thinking about how to create those safe spaces for people to share and be listened to. And you sort of briefly alluded for those that do disclose that they are having suicidal thoughts, even though it's common, there might be moments where you are worried that they are actually at risk. You mentioned talking about reaching out to support. What sort of support do you mean in that context?
Well, if someone is thinking about suicide and maybe indicates, that they're thinking a bit more, that it's not just a way of coping through their thoughts, you might want to help them with a therapist. I mean, we're Clearhead. This is what we do. We have great systems for matching people to therapists. Obviously, it's funded through employees. We also have some people can nominate therapy to family members. Depends on where you work and the policies around it all. But that's a great one. I think get a professional involved. They can do further risk assessment. But like I said, if it was imminent, like they're going, I might just go do it now, and I've got the means. Men do go through with it more than women typically. I reckon that's something to do with testosterone. But yeah, and to do with the fact that women are just probably more open about it, actually, earlier on. Now I say it. Whereas men aren't saying it till it's really, really intense. And again, there's always generalizations. I don't even know what men and women are anymore. I'm just talking people with certain bodies and certain biology that sometimes tracks to certain genders. I think in those cases, you may need to get the police involved. If it was really imminent, it would have to be really imminent. But get their advice. Or there's crisis support networks. So in every different region in New Zealand, there's mental health crisis teams. Sometimes they have different names. You can find that through the Mental Health Foundation website. Just look up crisis team, mental health crisis team on Google, and you'll find a directory you can use. They can even just give you support. They can give you they may not come out. They've got limited resources. There's a lot of mental health stuff going on around New Zealand, but they can offer support. And also there's pathways. I don't want to see a therapist, even a GP is a good starting point. Just support them to get some professional help, and do your best. And it's not all on you, do your best to intervene if that happens. But honestly, 90% of the time, just hearing someone's concern and the fact that I've thought about it, like I just know guys that are just completely broken into tears when they've just named it out loud. Like, yeah, I have thought about suicide. And I think that was probably like a changing point for them. So that is the common experience. Don't freak out too much, but just know there's these professional services that are there and exist, and will, if you let them know the risk is there, they'll kick in the gear.
Absolutely. You could see it as, you're really the conduit in which you're connecting them to help. Because often as well, when people aren't well, they don't have the thought process to think clearly, I'm struggling, therefore I need professional help. Sometimes they need you to connect the dots for them, or they need you to help them book the appointment. So that's kind of the role you could play in this person's life in terms of providing them the support and in some cases preventing them from losing their lives. And, I think the thing that's we've been discussing is in the context of someone who is ready to open up and share what they're thinking, ask for help, be ready to potentially accept any of that help. But what if you know someone is struggling? You could really see it as a friend or a colleague or a manager, and you've kind of tried to a few times reach out to them and say, hey, how are you? To give them an opportunity to share, but they have chosen not to. What should you do in that context?
That can be tricky. And the first thing that comes to mind is maybe you're not the right person, and that's fine. You know, I've worked on many mental health teams, and sometimes on quite a big team, one of us would be the person that they really connect to. So we still all have our roles in that team, but we'd focus on that one person being the connector, and I would give a psychological opinion, etc. So that's in a health space. But I think the same is true of a manager or a family member, is figure out, go, okay, cool, maybe it's not me. I need to get over myself. I'm not going to be the saving the hero here. But maybe someone else would be better suited to having that conversation and support that other person through your knowledge, through your observations, to have that conversation. If that doesn't work, they don't want to talk to anyone, well, that's tricky, you know? Like, at that point, I think the best thing to do is understand that, let them know you're there, and just drop seeds. Just always be like going, hey, I'm noticing this, like, we can talk, or hey, or just like, if you have contact therapy, here's a website, or just not too forceful, just like here's some pathways, and I'm here, and if the way you want support isn't talking about it, let's go fishing. Let's go do something together. Let's go have some fun. Because people are probably just feeling really lonely too, you know, and you can offer support. You don't necessarily need to go there into that space. And maybe when someone feels safe and they trust you, or they're feeling more well-being because you've supported them to have connection and do things that are purposeful and meaningful, maybe at some point they'll be ready. So yeah, those are some options I would consider.
You mentioned loneliness. You know, part of the disease is that even if you do have friends, family, loved ones around you, you don't necessarily feel that you do. You feel lonely. You feel like no one understands you. You feel like no one would be there even if you ask for help. There is a distortion in how you actually perceive your social circles. And I guess broadly, you feel lonely, as you mentioned. What do you advise to help people who can see their loved ones struggling with loneliness?
I mean, what you're describing sounds to me like depression. Like I think when you're seeing things negatively despite evidence to the contrary, that's quite a depression sort of mindset. What can you do in that case? I mean, there is always, like I said, there's the option to suggest GP. I'm a psychologist. I'm not a medical professional. And I don't love medication, if I'm honest, but I do see its role, and I think we sometimes jump to it too quickly. But I do think sometimes when someone's in such a depressive mindset, they're not willing to accept or even see the connections around them, that it can be useful to consider something like an antidepressant, because it can just bring them up a little bit to then start engaging in some of their support networks and things, and I'll start seeing those things, and the doctor then can manage the risk of it too. So that can be an option in those cases where there's quite an intense depression. Because even as a psychologist, when I do therapy with people who are in a really depressed state of mind, just some weeks it might be worse than others, I can't make a lot of progress. It can be really awkward. We sit there in silence. Everything I say is bad. There's nothing I can say right. And it's just hard. I think that it's just a really hard situation. But yeah, I think just like I think showing you're there by your behavior, not just your words. Like, be consistent too. Like, if you say you're going to be there with someone, be there. Don't say it otherwise. I mean, if you can't, there's a really good reason, of course. Send them a message. People aren't silly. They'll understand. But yeah, try your best to be supportive in your behavior. And sometimes a medical option can be. Doctors will often say, again, not giving a medical opinion, but doctors will often say, you need to take this for quite a long point of time. I don't think I've certainly worked with people where they've gone onto antidepressants, really engaged with therapy, made a lot of changes to their life, and withdrawn off the antidepressant within 6 months. And I think that's been a great approach for them. And they understand the withdrawal effects. They understand they might feel a little bit depressed and more anxious when they come off it. And they're working with a professional to coach them and support them through that process. It can be a great option. That's about all I can say on that. It's a tricky situation too for even us professionals.
So is there a context where people would feel lonely without the depression element? And what would we do in that context?
Well, it depends how you define it. Personally, I think those two things are highly connected. I think there can be a situation, right, where someone has a lot of friends and family but is single. And I think that can be called loneliness a lot. They can feel like, what's wrong with me? Why I'm like really successful. I have friends and family members, but I still don't have a person. I don't have this person who's really close to me. I think that's different. I think that is, but I think some people, when they say lonely, that's what they're talking about. And they're not getting their intimacy needs met, sexually, physically. So you got less oxytocin, less feel-good chemicals that you get from those sorts of things. I do think that is its own thing that I do still think it's probably a depressive element to loneliness. It's like, what is depression? Anxiety you can define, right? It's a response to threat. Stress is a response to overwhelm. Depression is complicated. Can come from all sorts of things, but a disconnection is something I think in the center of it. But you could be disconnected from a sense of worth, disconnected from people around you, disconnected from your culture, disconnected from all sorts of things. And someone's lacking a partner and feeling lonely because of that. I don't know. I think therapy is great. I think trying to understand what's going on in terms of perhaps even their attachment styles is often a big thing in terms of being anxious or avoidant or whatever kind of attachment styles, and trying to undo that a little bit, because you're obviously probably pushing people away that are interested in you. I think all those things, I think therapy will really help. I think talking about it with friends will really help. I think trying to seek intimacy through connections, fully consented intimacy through friendships and family members in terms of like hugs and support, and you can cuddle with friends, like men can cuddle together. God, they don't in New Zealand, they do in other cultures. I think it's quite sad, actually. I think we probably really do want to cuddle each other. And then you see people say that in sports, that they're just trying to touch each other, and I think there's probably some truth to that. I think physical touch and intimacy with friends and family and is really important, rather than putting that all into one person. My entire community and everything that was as a human and has been for 1,000 years is now one person, and it's all on them. And if I don't have that person, I'm stuffed. I think that mindset is very helpful, and I think maybe we've come to think that. I think we need to. I think especially men, commonly men, but it's always just generalization. Sometimes lack wider support networks, even with partners. So they might have a partner, but then fairly lonely socially. And I think there's some really useful ways to achieve that. I actually think it's an important part of resilience. I think you could be really well, you could be thriving, you could be succeeding. But you might, let's use a metaphor, like you might have a nice house, but we're in a really earthquake-prone country. So you want to make sure that house can stand earthquakes. And if it's not been, you're in an earthquake-prone area and you haven't strengthened your house on a good day when it's not shaking, that house is going to collapse. Even if it looks good, everything is great. It might not have the right, the foundations might be wrong. So I think when we're well, and if we notice like we don't have a support network, we don't have a community or a wider community we're a part of, find that, find it through activity, find it through hobbies, find it through, it could be hunting, fishing, like more traditional, like masculine things. I'd like going fighting even, like, in terms of not just going out and fighting, but I mean like as a sport. That's quite a common one where people find comradeship and a sense of place and a sense of community, which is going to support well-being anyway. And it's going to mean you got all these people that care about you and know you and can notice what's going on for you, that can support you in times of crisis or times when hard things happen, because it doesn't matter how resilient you are, it's going to be tested at some point in your life as we age and encounter loss and challenges. So yeah, I think that's something I think I see in men, even in relationships, put a lot on their partners, and yeah, that can lead to violence, and that can lead to all sorts of issues. So I think it's really important that not only men, but we all really make sure we engage in communities, and that takes time, right? It takes time. You got to show up regularly. Trust will build. You'll build a stronger connection with the people there just through being there and being yourself over time, and then you've got that support network, and you're a more resilient person.
We talked about support networks, communities, medication, therapy as different things that people can utilize as part of their toolkit to staying well. What is the role of workplaces in all of this to support and improve our men's mental health?
Oh, good question. It's hard in just the context of men, but I have been brought into workplaces when suicide has occurred in a workplace, and it's been a male every time because I'm in the men's wellbeing space. And I think a lot, everything I've been saying applies at work. I think it's tricky, right? Sometimes some sort of work-life separation, personal life separation can be useful. But I think the more we're open about our lives with the people we work with, the people we trust, the more they'll notice when you're not doing well, the more they'll understand, hey, at home right now, Sam's having major problems in his relationship, and maybe he shouldn't be on the dangerous machinery, or maybe he shouldn't be the one bearing this responsibility right now. And I think that is health and safety, by just awareness and good communication and authentic, a culture of true sharing. And it's really interesting going to these workplaces because they're like, oh, no, we're really honest with each other. We share. And I was like, oh, did anyone know this guy was suffering? And I was like, no. And I was like, hey, do you even know what's going on for each other? And then they start talking. Everyone's like, well, no, I didn't know that about you, God. And it's like, okay, we think we have a good culture. If you think you have a good culture, you think everything is good, stop and question it, because you probably don't. If you're not assuming you don't, you almost probably don't have a good culture, I think you got to assume you probably don't know things, assume you might not be creating that space at work, assume people might not feel safe to be fully open. And if people do choose to open up, you treat that information really carefully and privately, and don't make them feel vulnerable in their role at work. Though, like I said, there may be a conversation you say, hey, quietly, I don't think you should be doing this thing today. And they might feel annoyed by that because they just want to get on with it. But this is really important. It could save someone. I do know about, I was looking at, I think it was only up to 2021, some stats from WorkSafe, and I think 12% of suicides are work-related. So I think work can put stress on people. We know this. So I think workplaces do need to take responsibility for that. And I think EAP, seeing therapy, is definitely one thing. But it's got to go a little bit deeper. We've sort of been talking more at Clearhead. It's much bigger in Australia. It's definitely emerging in New Zealand, but this idea of psychosocial risk, looking at how do we actually design work? How do we organize? What is the culture at work? What is the kind of interactions that are occurring between people? What is the pace of work? There's just so many aspects of actually work itself and how that's organized and designed and created that need to be considered, because those are creating stress for people, and stress leads to a bunch of different outcomes that can be negative in terms of mental health. So I think work does need to take responsibility actually for the way they're doing things and the way they're organizing and distributing work. And I think that's really important. I think Australia has done a great job in bringing that to the forefront, and I think New Zealand needs to catch up. And I think that framework of looking at work holistically, looking at work in terms of all these factors, and really truly thinking about that and changing work and being willing to shift work and how we do things and still make money, or succeed in at least the purpose of work, that's hard. But I do think that's something managers should take more seriously and are taking, I think, more seriously these days. And just be willing to change. Not just tick boxes. I think that'll, if we can reduce people's stress at work, if work can become a supportive place for people who are when they're struggling at home, that's going to be really good for people's mental health. So work's a third of someone's life typically. You spend 8 hours working, 8 hours for yourself each day, and then 8 hours sleeping, and you can hopefully get a weekend. But it's a huge part of someone's life and identity. I think I think there's a lot of work can do. Hopefully that gave you some ideas, but you could get really deep on that alone.
Are there like additional considerations for more male-dominated industries, for example, farming or construction, that we need to consider beyond what you've just mentioned about the workplace?
That's a good one, because what I've found working in this, like with men and within mental health, is people always like, my industry is the worst mental health. And like, I do think the farmers and construction, there's probably some truth to that, but I look for stats online and I can't clearly find anything that's really clearly looking at it per industry. If someone does have that, please send it to me, because I've been looking. And I have seen people quote it in their own slides, but I'm not quite sure where they get their statistics from, maybe from a survey, as opposed to something like a census or some bigger database. But yeah, I think there's certain aspects of certain work. I think farmers have a huge amount of stress in New Zealand. It's a big part of our economy, and it's often quite a lone work. You've got a huge area of land you're managing, maybe with a small team if you're lucky. Huge pressures financially. You're getting pressures environmentally now, and I think it's hard, right? It's because I work in the environmental space, and farms can be really, have a big impact on the environment, but I don't want to put that on farmers. We've all got to this, the way we're farming, the way we're, the way water runs through farms and the way that affects waterways, the way we're actually using land and building soil and all those things, managing forests, thinking about it all. That's challenging. Putting it on farmers is another thing to put on them. I have a lot of compassion for farmers, and I think it can be a really isolating industry. I talked to a guy, Doug Avery, the resilient farmer. You can check that out on Tough Talk. He's really good. He had big breakdowns, close to suicide, a lot of drinking. And then he actually discovered he sort of focused on more regenerative farming, using different plants that sequester more carbon, and in a place where had a lot more drought, and they grew a lot more less water, and farming massively changed and shifted. So I think he did that he just went out to an event. People were telling him to go, he didn't want to go, and he met this guy, and this guy inspired him, and it changed his life and changed his whole farming approach. So just that step he made to he was isolated drinking, not dealing with it, to go out to a social event with farmers that were doing innovative things, not only brought him out of his mental health, gave him a solution, gave him a financial solution. He deeply cared about that land. The land's now more environmentally savvy. I think all that improved, and I think so I think the answers are out there if we look for them, in whatever industry. And construction. I think construction, going into construction companies, they can be quite a dominant, maybe traditional masculine culture sometimes. I always start by saying, hey, let's all just talk about our feelings, and then they all look scared and they just say, I'm just messing with you, and they laugh, and that's the culture of making jokes, and then I'm in when I enter those spaces. So I do think there's sometimes a social norm in those places around being a certain type of guy and being quite hyper-masculine, performing a little bit more, and I think that's a factor in the construction industry, and maybe it's a cultural thing that needs to shift, and that could be tricky. I can't say I know how to do that. I think as an individual person in that, you can model a different way of being and be a leader there and create that culture around you, and start small. And so these industries are different, but like I said, dentists think they have the worst mental health too, and I think we all just have different problems because of our different industries.
You mentioned obviously that this individual ended up initially coping by drinking. What's the role of addiction in how men tend to self-medicate instead of having healthier coping behaviors? So how do we address them in the context of as well, its role in violence, and men expressing mental health less in the context of sadness, but maybe more in the context of anger? It seems like a very potent mix with expressing it as anger, drinking, and any other sort of, self-medicating initiatives that they might do.
Totally. I think this is an interesting conversation. I know it came up recently with Mike King, and I think his comments just weren't very nuanced in what he was saying. But he was trying to make some points. I do think there's a difference. There's self-medicating, and then there's using alcohol in a destructive fashion, right? And they both have destructive elements, but you can you can drink, like I drank alcohol as a young person to cope with social situations, and it worked. I was much more confident in social situations drinking, but it didn't make me get more comfortable in social situations. Like, it didn't fix my problem. It just fixed it temporarily at that stage of my life, and that had some use, but it also led to me doing things I regretted. It also led to hangovers, and it affected my health. It also it could lead to all sorts of problems, and it was the times when I improved in those spaces socially, when I went into those situations and felt really anxious and got all shaky and had to breathe deeply. That's what helped me change. But in a way, it sort of did numb me, and I think that was self-medication. But then some people, I think, maybe in cases do want to take their own life and might drink just to do that, to push through the inhibition of, like, we naturally, humans, anxiety is about stopping ourselves dying, ultimately. It's a threat response designed to protect us. So instinctively, we don't want to kill ourselves. But drinking, I think, can help people push through inhibitions. I think some people go out and drink and want to fight. I think that's quite different. I don't think they're self-medicating. I do think maybe they're drinking, just there's a destruction there as a coping mechanism, just to get out and adrenaline and feel different and feel maybe some sense of control. So again, it's coping, but I think there's a distinction there. And I do think alcohol can just be really destructive and not self-medicating at all. And I think similar patterns with drugs. You can get really deep around medication through psychoactive drugs, because there's a lot of evidence to show actually, like, MDMA and various psychedelics are used in therapy now, and are amazing when used with a therapist as opposed to just someone doing that on their own. So it's a complex world, drugs, and but I do think alcohol plays a huge factor in, if men are already conditioned to be angry and violent, and that's kind of okay, or seen as more okay than having a big cry to their friends when they're drunk, that's probably what they're going to do, and then they're going to be less inhibited, and they're disinhibited, and they're going to be more disinhibited, sorry, God, that word, in their approach, and they're probably going to, suddenly they could do something really dangerous, drive a car really fast, bring a weapon, hit someone a lot harder than they might have if they had not been drinking. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some nuances around drugs and alcohol. I think the intention behind why we do something is really important. Drinking can be perfectly fine. A lot of people use drugs recreationally, and I think in less damaging ways than others. But both those things can be very destructive. Both those things can lead to really bad outcomes for either the person themselves or other people. And sometimes it can get someone along and coping and be okay for a while, but it's not going to ever fix the problem. Similar to antidepressant. I don't think antidepressant fundamentally fixes anything, but being on an antidepressant may support you to fix your problems. And alcohol isn't going to do that. It's not a very good medication.
Well, I think hopefully through the chat that we've had, people listening will have a chance to understand that there are ways in which you can get someone that you love, who might be a bit more resistant to speak up and share what's going on with them, how to create the environment to allow that to be possible, and then what are all the healthier mechanisms that we could share with them that can help them get to a point where they can solve the problem and get to a place of flourishing and thriving in the community and in themselves. We like to end these things with one simple question, which is, what's your one wellbeing practice, Sam?
Oh, honestly, I just most importantly get my foundations right. And it's not one thing, it's eat good food, exercise, and sleep well. If I'm maintaining those things, I practice mindfulness. Yes, I'm aware of my thoughts and enhance my self-reflection. But honestly, the eat, move, sleep, fundamental. Do those things, then work on your headspace, then practice mindfulness, then do all the other things, hobbies and everything. But yeah, just I think as a bare minimum. You might think you do those things too. I think I do those things. I think there's a lot of room for improvement.
I mean, even something as simple as breathing sometimes as well, right? It's like
breathing. I mean, if we were talking just like coping technique, that's the one I use the most. Probably was using it before we talked today, Angela. I use it when I'm waiting to talk in a circle. I use it all the time, even during talking when I'm getting a bit vulnerable. And like I didn't find I got too shaky today, but sometimes opening up about my past can just be hard, and I got to stop and breathe deeply into my diaphragm and slowly. And it's an amazing technique for anxiety. And just supporting you to feel present. If you're feeling a little bit sad, you need to actually connect with the world around you. But get the fundamentals right, and then add on some breathing, and that's a great starting point.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Sam, and for everyone for listening. Have a good day. That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.